Hello, it's Jimmy and
Charlotte.
special guest talking about The Doll Factory by Elizabeth Macneal. This is a bit of chat on BookTube. I think Simon Savage is mates with Elizabeth Macneal, and he's definitely talked about this book on his channel. It's set in the Victorian period in around 1840s, 50s. It's kind of a thriller. It gets quite dark. It's got the pre-Raphaelite painters in it. It's got the Great Exhibition of London in it. So it's got various true historical figures, obviously fictionalised, and events mixed with some characters and events that were made up just for the novel. And I really liked it. Charlotte read it last year, I think, and really liked it. And I read it in the past week, and I was staying up all night reading it because I kept wanting to know what would happen next.
I think that's one of the best things about the book, is it's a really gripping thriller, and from the cover you might not necessarily get that impression, especially in terms of Victorian style literature, but it's such a compelling story. It really, even from the get-go, you were totally drawn into a really complex and rich world of characters who are all very well fleshed out, and you're really rooting for the main character in particular to kind of come good and escape the drudgery of her life. So yeah, I definitely agree that it's incredibly gripping.
Yeah, I definitely felt that as well, where you're hoping things will work out for the characters, like various characters in different ways. You're sort of hoping for certain outcomes, but you don't know if that's going to happen, because a lot of the characters, a lot of what it talks about is poverty in Victorian London and class in Victorian London and gender in that setting, and the characters come from different backgrounds, with quite subtle differences as well. It's not just this one's rich, this one's poor. There's more detail to it than that.
I think if you're interested in an economic history of Victorian London, this is probably not going to be 100% for you, but I think it gives a really good insight into women, especially young women, young working class women, and the pressures and also the kind of inevitability of the situations they find themselves in. Another book that I've just finished is The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, and I know you had mentioned that you kind of, the myth of the story, the mythos of one of the characters kind of reminded you a little bit of Jack the Ripper, and that kind of, those sorts of, the kind of culture, the Victorian interest in the Victorian culture that's developed around that. But for me, after reading The Five, I really did kind of draw links between the women in that book and Iris, the main character, and some of the women that she encounters and some of the other women in the story, in terms of how brilliantly this book captures that experience of what it must have been like, and the fear and the desperation that these women felt just to live day to day. I would say that it's not all dark and dreary though, and there are lots of interesting ideas that are being explored.
One thing that I think is really nice about it is it's such a rich world that Elizabeth Macneal portrays in the book, and that is drawing from historical sources. It really feels like she must have done a ton of research into all sorts of different things, and it's packed with little historical details that you don't need to know anything about Victorian London or the pre-Raphaelite artists or any of that to enjoy the book. You can just read it as a straight up exciting thriller with some twisty turnies and some sort of romantic elements, but if you are interested, or if you've read a little bit about those historical things, then you'll pick up all sorts of details as well, and that makes it really satisfying. And I don't know loads about that period, but it made me want to go and learn more.
Another interesting theme within the book is obsession and collection, and I won't go too much into detail because I don't want to spoil the plot, but one of the main characters, Silas, is a taxidermist who has these incredible kind of intricate but very macabre collections of animals, and the obsessive detail in which he has constructed these taxidermy animals is a huge foreshadowing to what happens later on, but it's also very interesting in terms of how one fulfills themselves and how this character in particular can develop satisfaction in his own fantasy and his own obsession, and how he can construct an entirely different narrative to reality but still be very fulfilled by that. And I think that's reflected in his collection and also his behaviour and his actions later in the story. One book that this really reminded me of was The Collector by John Fowles. If you wanted to read another book about obsession that is equally disturbing, I definitely recommend that. And it is very interesting to read about the way that especially men construct, like I say, fantasy narratives for themselves and kind of validate these ideas. I say interesting, I mean obviously incredibly terrifying, because it does feel very familiar to people that you might even know in real life. So they are fantastically well-drawn character studies.
Yeah, I think that Elizabeth Macneal does a really good job of getting in the heads of different characters, and different chapters they're all written in the third person, but they're kind of through the perspective of the character that chapter focuses on. And the chapters that focus on Silas, the creepy taxidermist, give you an insight into the way his mind works, and in a way that's kind of sympathetic to the character without making you necessarily support the character. Obviously you don't, and you're sort of terrified and sort of hate the character, but it just shows it's just a really effective style of writing that she manages to engage with these characters, each in a different way, each through the mindset of that character, and really makes you feel like you have an insight into a real person's head.
Oh, it's really raining now. Something that because we both enjoyed the book so much, a discussion that we had is how we felt very deflated when the book was over because we enjoyed it so much. And actually, that I've not had that experience with a book in a very long time, and I still am looking for my next kind of fix of something very similar. So if you know of novels that are kind of in the similar vein, maybe historical novels, the one that we discussed that came to mind was Fingersmith,
By Sarah Waters.
That is in a very similar vein, but if you have any recommendations, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I was sitting around, I finished it a couple of days ago, and today I was sitting around thinking, I want to drop in on those characters and check what they're up to and what's the latest. So I would be interested in reading a similar novel. I'm also kind of interested to find out more about the historical figures who were involved. I'd like to read a good kind of narrative non-fiction history of the pre-Raphaelites. And one character who makes a cameo in this book, who's a real person, is Lizzie Siddall, who was a model and also a painter herself, I think. And I actually got a book from my sister about her, so I might borrow that back off her when she's done with it. So yeah, there's tons of different directions of further reading that it makes you want to take. So yeah, any recommendations for books that sound like The Doll Factory, or if you've read it that you think would be a good next step, please do share.
I know Elizabeth Macneal is writing another book in lockdown. I think she's finished the first draft. You can also buy some of Elizabeth Macneal's really cool pottery, because she's also a ceramicist. So support your authors and your independent makers.
Thank you.
Bye.